Chapter 39 A Boy's Tears. It was an evening in July. The Duke of Reichstadt was in the bedroom in his new apartments, on the third floor of the Palace of Schönbrunn. Through the open window he could see the main entrance to the palace, the two red marble obelisks, surmounted by eagles with outstretched wings, the little bridge which spanned the black water of the Rhine, and opposite the Rudolfstrasse, the two stone lions facing one another. In the distance, in one direction lay Vienna, and in the other the mountains. Little by little, the noises of the day dissolved into the twilight. The boy could hear the subdued hum of the city settling down for the night. Now and again, a military order rang out in the main courtyard, and flights of martinets pierced the golden dusk with long-drawn, croaking cries. Far away, rosy clouds shed a soft light on the summit of the Kolmberg. One after the other, tawny shadows blotted out the hills, which stood shoulder to shoulder in the direction of Dornbach. All at once the young Duke turned around. Captain Foresti had just come into the room. He was clad all in black. His face was pale, and some invisible burden appeared to oppress him. With his entrance, the darkness of the night seemed to fill the room all at once. The boy had a presentiment of disaster. He recoiled against the wall as the messenger of misfortune advanced towards him. The news of Napoleon's death had reached England at the beginning of July. The banking house of Rothschild had at once dispatched a courier to carry it to Vienna. For the first time for many years, Metternich spent a night without nightmares. Through all the courts of Europe swept a breath of pure air, and sovereigns breathed freely again. When he learned that he had nothing more to fear from his son-in-law, the emperor found himself in embarrassing perplexity. To be sure, he was entirely of Metternich's opinion. The dead man's light must be hid under a bushel. Nothing must be said about his death. Above all, his will must not be published. But the emperor's position as a grandfather imposed upon him the duty of breaking the news to the dead man's son. It was a thankless job, and his courage failed him. He sought for somebody to relieve him of it. De Tristan, the boy's principal tutor, was away at Würzburg. The emperor nominated Foresti. The captain had waited 2 days for a favorable opportunity of softening what he knew must be a cruel blow to the boy. This evening, the quiet hour of twilight struck him as suited to his purpose. He gazed at the boy who stood before him anxiously. The Duke was now 10 years old, and looked 12. He was tall and slender. His long curls had been cut, and his fair hair now waved around his brow. He was wearing white breeches and a dark coat, which set off his rosy complexion and his blue eyes. "Prince," said Foresti, "you made your first communion last month, so you are no longer a child, and you should not be treated as one. Today, your august grandfather has entrusted me with a painful mission. I must ask you to summon up all your courage, and also all your Christian sentiments." The boy leant against the wall. His hands trembled. He stared with ever-increasing fear at this man, who he knew now had come here to hurt him. "My mother?" he asked. "No, it has nothing to do with Madame, your mother." The boy went still paler. In a voice so low that Foresti could hardly hear him, he whispered, "He is dead." The captain bowed his head, as though to himself. The Duke repeated, "He is dead." Foresti made the prince sit down, took him by the hand, and talked to him at length. With decent reservations he explained to his pupil that Napoleon had ended his days at St. Helena, an island in the Atlantic Ocean. He had lived there, well treated, and surrounded by a little court, but an incurable disease had gradually undermined his health. He had died a good Christian. The boy listened to him wide-eyed, with his face bloodless. Never had his masters spoken to him about his father of their own accord. The first time one of them condescended to do so, it was to tell him that his father was dead. "St. Helena," he repeated, "St. Helena." All at once he moved away from Foresti, went and sat down at the window, buried his face in his hands, and burst into tears. The assistant tutor let him weep. The boy wept half the night, and during the next day. His tutor made no attempt to console him, for they knew beforehand that anything they could say or do would be in vain. Towards evening, on the next day, the boy pulled himself together, dried his eyes, and started walking up and down the room. To the great surprise of de Tristan and Foresti, during the next few weeks he asked no questions about his father. He realized that nobody around him could sincerely share his grief, lest it should be profaned. He kept it to himself, shut up in his own heart. Without saying a word, he donned the black clothes which were given him. His household, alone among the members of the Austrian court, went into mourning for 3 days. The emperor, with Metternich's approval, had decided that they should do so. At the same time, the Duke's tutors were recommended to show themselves in public as little as possible while they were wearing mourning. In the Parma Opera House, Marie-Louise had just been listening to Rosine's great song of the Barber of Seville. Then a member of her suite handed her a copy of the Piedmont Gazette. Thus it was through a newspaper announcement that she learned she had been a widow for the past 2 months. A motion of such a kind is often disastrous to pregnant women. Marie-Louise was 8 months gone, for the second time, with a child by Napoleon. She felt very much upset. Above all, she resented the fact that she should have learned of her widowhood from a newspaper. Why shouldn't they have sent her a courier from Vienna? It was not until July 20th that she received the official intimation. Meanwhile, on the previous day, she had written a letter to Madame de Creneville, her intimate friend, in which she described her emotional disturbance. I must confess that I was much affected, though I never had any warm feeling of any kind towards him. I cannot forget that he was the father of my son, and that far from treating me badly, as the world believes, He always treated me with every consideration, which is the most one can expect in a political marriage. So I was very much upset, and while one should rejoice that he ended his unhappy life in a Christian way, I would have wished many more years of life and happiness for him, so long as he was nowhere near me. In short, Marie-Louise was affected by Napoleon's death, but it was only one annoyance amid many other troubles: the heat, the mosquitoes, her approaching childbirth. She went on, "I have been so badly bitten in the face that I look a fright, and I am glad that I cannot appear in public. In fact, the mosquitoes came in handy. Marie-Louise's court went into mourning for 3 months, but at once a difficulty arose. What was her husband to be called in the official announcement of his death? The Emperor, Napoleon, Bonaparte. All these appellations were in bad taste, and awakened hateful memories. It was Napoleon, that man of fertile mind, who rescued his best beloved from her dilemma. After juggling Napoleon away while he was alive, he proceeded to juggle him away now that he was dead. In accordance with Napoleon's suggestion, Napoleon became merely our august sovereign's Serenissimo consort. Prince consort, he who had played pitch and toss with thrones, brought all the kings of Europe to their knees, and conquered half the world. It took some thinking out. On July 30th, Marie-Louise attended a fine memorial service for her husband, which was celebrated in the chapel of the palace at Sala, one of her summer residences. She sat in her private box, and her long black veil came in very useful to hide the size of her stomach. She ordered 1,000 masses to be said in Parma, and the same number in Vienna, but she forbade the officials to mention Napoleon's name. Having thus fulfilled all obligations of a good wife towards a dead husband, she set off at the end of July for Solagrange with a quiet mind. There, on August 9th, 1821, she gave birth in secret to a son. On October 15th, Antomarchi arrived in Parma. He presented himself at the ducal palace, and requested audience with Her Majesty. He wished to show her the letter in which Napoleon had introduced him to her, but it was Napoleon who received him. "I cannot let you see Her Majesty," said Napoleon, as though he regretted it very much. "You would only increase her grief. She sobs and sighs all day long, but I shall be glad to act as your intermediary." Antomarchi accepted his good offices. Napoleon left the room, but he was soon back. "Her Majesty has read the letter. She is delighted to know Napoleon's last wishes in your respect, but before giving effect to them, she must submit them to her august father." The doctor proceeded to ask for news of the Duke of Reichstadt. "He's doing splendidly," said Napoleon. "Is he in good health? As strong as a lion? And is he promising?" "Positively bursting with genius. Never was there a more promising boy." So Antomarchi went his way, with nothing but a diamond ring on his finger for Godspeed. That night they were performing Rossini's La Cenerentola at the Parma Opera House. The doctor attended the performance. He saw Marie-Louise in her box. She looked thin, haggard, and exhausted. Only a widow's grief, Antomarchi thought to himself, could explain such shocking havoc. Marie-Louise had thus definitely broken with everything which might remind her, directly or indirectly, of her first husband. She refused to let Marchand bring her the lace which Napoleon had left her in his will, nor would she accept the bracelet which Napoleon's faithful servant had woven out of a lock of his dead master's hair. The Duke of Reichstadt was no better served in his inheritance. Marchand had also woven a watch chain for him out of Napoleon's hair. He never received it. Metternich, moreover, consistently refused to let Marchand, Montholon, or Bertrand see him, and hand over to him the personal belongings with which Napoleon had entrusted them. Nor was this all. Not content with declining her husband's heart, Marie-Louise would not accept the plaster death mask which Antomarchi had made from Napoleon's face. His death mask passed from hand to hand. It reached the servants' quarters. It served as a plaything for the children of the palace steward, who dragged it about on the end of a string. In Rome, Madame Mère adopted a very different attitude. This old Corsican peasant woman showed a soul to match the misfortune which had overtaken her. On August 15th, she wrote to Lord Castlereagh to request the remains of her son. The Emperor Napoleon's mother hereby claims from his enemies the ashes of her son. My son has no need of honors. His name suffices for his fame, but I have need to kiss his mortal remains. In the name of justice, in the name of humanity, I adjure you not to refuse my request. To obtain the remains of my son, I am ready to supplicate the whole ministry. I am ready to supplicate his Britannic Majesty. I gave Napoleon to France and to the world. In the name of God, in the name of all mothers, I hereby beseech you, milord, not to refuse me my son's remains. She never received any reply. Yet when a man dies on the scaffold, if his mother asks for his body after his execution, nobody dares to deny it to her. Chapter 40. Like father, like son. Little by little, to the great satisfaction of his entourage, the Duke of Reichstadt seemed to be turning into an Austrian prince. This desirable result was not achieved without difficulty, but it certainly appeared to be in sight. He had been expansive. He became reserved, somewhat shy and adept, if not at deceit, at least at concealing his thoughts. Feeling that he was spied upon day and night, he learnt the meaning of distrust himself, and to appreciate the value of silence. His tutors flattered themselves that they had killed the Napoleon in him. They thought they could go as far as they liked. A year after his father's death, Foresti got him to write an essay about the geography of St. Helena. At the beginning of the summer of 1823, Marie-Louise decided to take a trip to Austria. The year before, being pregnant by Neperg for the third time, She had had to stay in Parma. She had given birth to a daughter who died. She arrived in Vienna on June 6th. It was 3 years since she had last kissed her son, and meanwhile Napoleon had died. A mother, however little of a mother she may be, cannot fail to touch the heart of a son. The boy, yearning for affection, was delighted to see his mother. Marie-Louise took him with her to the castle of Luxembourg, then to Baden, and finally to Persenburg, where the imperial family were in residence for most of the summer. The Duke spent several happy weeks at Persenburg. He was on holiday. Etiquette was relaxed, and he had his mother with him. Napoleon was there too, but in the boy's eyes he was simply the Grand Chamberlain of the court of Parma, the first in precedence, and the most respectful of the Duchess's subjects. Marie-Louise returned to Parma on September 3rd. Her son begged her to take him with her, but she refused. The presence of this boy of 12, with his observant eyes, would be an embarrassment to her. The Duke of Reichstadt witnessed his mother's departure with a heavy heart. Then he went back to his cage at Schönbrunn, whose door had been set ajar for him only for a few weeks. Still, during the summer, something had happened that gave him great delight. His grandfather appointed him a cadet. This rank enabled him to wear military dress, a close-fitting little uniform with a shako surmounted by a tuft. He was already quite a dandy, and very careful of his person. He held himself erect, with shoulders squared and head high. He carried his cane with an air, and set off his flowered waistcoat with a watch chain. He danced charmingly, but he was no singer. He had no ear for music except that of drums and trumpets. He was interested in anything which would prepare him, directly or indirectly, for a soldier's career. He flung himself enthusiastically into the most violent physical exercises, running, jumping, wrestling. He challenged his cousins to wrestle, and though they were older than he was, floored them. He rode on horseback till he tired himself, and learned to swim in a few lessons. At his first swimming lesson he jumped into the water and was fished out, gasping and frozen. "I thought I was going to be drowned," he said, "but I wanted to show the people who were watching me that I wasn't afraid." When he appeared in a drawing room, he looked so handsome, so aristocratic, that all the women wanted to kiss him and keep him beside them. They saw in him either the son of whom they had dreamed, or the lover he would one day become. They admired his gracefulness, his ease of manner, his natural distinction, but he shunned their homage. "My place is with men," he said. He could already hold his own in conversation, and he was quick at repartee. One day a lady of honor, very flirtatious, but with fading charms, was talking to him about France. "It must be a very fine country," he said, innocently. The lady looked him up and down. With pointed reference to Napoleon, she said dryly, "Yes, but it was much finer before you were born." The Duke stood squarely in front of her. "And so were you," he retorted. Lace handkerchiefs and fans stifled the company's laughter. The boy's rudeness earned him a reprimand, but it helped his reputation. When the incident was reported to Metternich, he frowned and muttered, "It's an obvious instance of that cursed French wit. Here was another nasty weed to be uprooted." There were not many left, for the teachers who surrounded the Duke were vigilant. De Tristan, in fact, had chosen good masters for him. Nevertheless, their pupil did not satisfy them entirely. He showed himself assiduous only in the study of modern history, and of anything that had to do with war. In addition, he knew the military code by heart. Towards the end of 1824, the boy suffered a grievous loss. Matthew von Collin, his favorite teacher, died suddenly of pneumonia. He was almost immediately replaced by Joseph Albanos, a consular of Lower Austria, who was entrusted with teaching the Duke Latin, philosophy, and history. The pupil did not benefit by the change. His new teacher was a gloomy, irritable person. He was an odd mixture of hot temper and cold calculation. With the role of the pedagogue, he combined that of the spy, shifty-eyed and sharp-eared. But by this time the Duke had an ally. On November 24th, 1824, his uncle, the Archduke Francis Charles, had married the Princess Sophie of Bavaria, the youngest of the Empress's half-sisters. In this way the boy's dear uncle, who had once burned Marie-Louise's doll, had become his own father's brother-in-law. What a welcome surprise awaited the Duke of Reichstadt, when for the first time he found himself in the presence of the new Archduchess. Could any boy have an aunt better fitted to inspire admiration and affection? Sophie was only 19, and she had all the prettiness of a bird, with its grace on the wing, its delicacy of line. Her neck had the curve of a stem carrying a corolla, a little too heavy for it. Her auburn hair, in curls framing her face, seemed to have a light of its own under the lace which covered it. Her large eyes bore witness to an affectionate, straightforward soul. She was clad in a simple muslin gown. She fluttered through life unconstrained, with a laugh on her lips, dancing on air, the living image of youth and grace. Despite the 6 years which separated their ages, when they met, Sophie and Franz felt that they were made for one another. The boy yearned for affection. Sophie asked nothing better than to give it to him. She held out her hands to him, and then clasped him in her arms. "My dear boy," she exclaimed. "My dear, my dear." The boy responded with one word, a word that hitherto had had no meaning for him, and had been of no use to him, a word that evoked the affection to which every child has a right, but which he had never known. "Mamma," he called her. So it was that he gave his heart to Sophie. Metternich and the Emperor were alone together in the Emperor's study. The audience which Francis granted to his chancellor every day was coming to an end. The sovereign was seated at his desk. He had aged. His face looked longer than ever, with his straight gray hair parted on either side of it. The pouches under his eyes sagged still more deeply. In front of him Metternich held himself stiffly in his gold-bespangled uniform. He wore a dark coat, white breeches, silk stockings, and buckled shoes. and the ram of the Order of the Golden Fleece hung from his neck. He had gone bald with the passing years, and his shining pate was shaped like an egg. The emperor's hands, once so delicate, were wasted with age. He assembled a sheaf of documents and handed them to his minister. "You may file these reports. I've read them with great satisfaction. Our police work is good, Metternich." The chancellor took the papers and bowed in silence. Then Francis took up an envelope which he had just sealed and showed it to his minister. "What do you think of my new seal?" Metternich bent his pale, impenetrable face over the parchment. "Your Majesty is inimitable. The impasto is delicate. The engraving is clear. There isn't a flaw. It's a new wax I'm using. It yields astonishing results." In quite sprightly style, the emperor went on. "Do you remember the seals which the French affixed to the Treaty of Luneville? What a disgrace they were! They realized it when they saw mine." Metternich half closed his prominent eyes. An ironical glance filtered between his heavy lids. "Still, it was a pity that the treaty cost your Majesty so much." The emperor's spirit sank. He nodded woefully. "It did indeed. We lost the Low Countries and a good part of Italy. But that's all been settled since." There was a silence, haunted by the memory of Napoleon. It was always like this. Francis could never look back on affairs of state without the shade of the cursed Corsican rising before him. He changed the conversation. "By the way, Metternich, what's the latest news from Parma?" "Quite satisfactory, sire. After visiting Genoa and Milan, the Archduchess has gone on to Naples and Palermo. Your Majesty need have no concern about her journey. General Neperg is in attendance. So Marie-Louise wrote to me. She also told me that Neperg's health was giving her great alarm. He has a cold of which he can't get rid. He coughs, and he's getting thin." "He overtaxes himself," said Metternich, with a straight face. "For that matter, we must admit that he administers the duchy excellently. Order reigns in Parma, and the people are quite contented." The emperor sighed. "We were fortunate in our choice of him. My poor little girl. Life owed her some compensation after her willingness to sacrifice herself to save the empire." Metternich stood rigid, with his flesh suddenly creeping at this too obvious reminder of the sacrifice of which he had been the instigator. The emperor abandoned this dangerous subject and went on. "I want to have a word or two with you about my grandson, Metternich. Does he get on all right with his new tutor?" The chancellor sank his chin in his white muslin cravat, and replied gravely, "I think your Majesty can only congratulate yourself on choosing Aubenas. Besides being a very competent teacher, he is devotion itself. He watches over the Duke as though he were his own son. Are you aware, sire, that he has broken the Duke of the habit of wetting his bed? He got up twice every night for a fortnight to awaken the prince. For such attention I shall be duly grateful to him, but you don't tell me whether he is satisfied with his pupil." "Not entirely, I must admit. You know the Duke, sire. You know how given he is to contradiction. He has great natural gifts, but one might almost say that he goes out of his way to do all he can to please his masters. He is a born actor, and he excels at dissimulating his feelings. Just at the moment when he seems on the point of giving way, he offers the stoutest resistance. He deliberately makes mistake after mistake in his essays, and it takes weeks of struggle to make him apply a rule of grammar correctly. His tutor, de Tristan, is driven to despair. There was another silence. Then Francis glanced fearfully around him, lowered his voice, and asked, "Now that we are alone, Metternich, tell me, does he ever talk about his father?" A yellow gleam flared in Metternich's eyes. "Never, sire." The emperor hesitated. Then he went on, "But does he think about him?" "Probably. Who is to stop him?" "You keep yourself well informed about him, Metternich." "I have no control over his thoughts, but I can answer for his acts. De Tristan makes a report to me every day, and all the servants in the Duke's household are in the pay of the police. He can do nothing without our being told." The emperor reflected for a moment or two. Then he continued, "I've long wanted to discuss this matter with you, Metternich. It's a delicate one. I know. I don't think that the prince ought to be kept in systematic ignorance about his father. To hide everything about Napoleon from his son would mean arousing his son's suspicions. It strikes me as essential, in fact, to present Napoleon to him as a great general and an organizer of genius. At the same time, skillful advantage should be taken of the opportunity to display before him all the misfortunes which, as a soldier carried away by ambition, Napoleon brought upon his country: the ruination of France, the loss of her best sons on the battlefields of Europe." "I share your opinion, sire. So does de Tristan. He has prepared for his pupils selected extracts from the memoirs which Gourgaud and Montholon wrote relating their experiences in St. Helena. Abenau's commentaries will do the rest." The emperor nodded. "And now," he went on, "I think that the time is nearly come when my grandson will be old enough to receive the legacy left him by his father." Despite his self-control, Metternich jumped. "What, sire? Would you dream of letting the Duke have the sword Napoleon carried at Austerlitz, the cloak he wore at Marengo, his camp beds, his medals, and all his other personal possessions? Why, there is not one of them which does not recall a defeat of our armies, a humiliation for Austria. I have of course considered the question from that point of view, Metternich. But are not a dead man's wishes sacred?" The Chancellor drew himself up to his full height. He raised his voice. "And what about reasons of state, sire? No moral question, no family affection, not even religion itself can prevail when the fate of the empire is at stake." Francis hung his head. Metternich went on, "Sire, we should avoid filling the Duke with false hopes, or nurturing the least ambition to him. From that point of view, anything which came to him from his father could only awaken in him dreams which would be a danger to the peace of Europe. We are under obligations to Louis the 18th. It was bad enough in itself to give the prince certain books. For my part, I should have been less generous." The emperor raised his head. "What do you mean, Metternich?" The Chancellor fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "Here," he said, "is a recent essay by the Duke. He was given the following subject: 'Write a speech by Hannibal to his troops before crossing the Alps. Be good enough to look at it, sire.'" The Emperor bent over the sheet of paper and read, "Soldiers, your country has a right to expect great things of you. Will you justify its expectations? You have more battles to fight, more cities to storm, more rivers to cross. Is there any man among you whose courage fails him?" With his nostrils quivering, Metternich said to his sovereign, "Sire, do not these words awaken an echo in you? Search your memory. Do you not remember the proclamation which Napoleon addressed to his army in 1796 at the gates of Italy? 'Soldiers, you are in rags. You are badly fed. The government owes you much, and it cannot give you anything.' Napoleon's proclamation wound up, 'Soldiers of the army of Italy, will you fail in courage and constancy?' The Emperor had gone as gray as ashes. 'That's enough,' he growled. But Metternich went on, in a cutting tone of voice, 'Your Majesty must forgive me, but it was those words that cost us our coal, Rivoli, and later Marengo. The son is already taking his father as his model. It is promising, is it not?' When Metternich had gone, the Emperor sat for a few moments staring before him, with his grandson's essay crumpled up in his hand. Then he got up, left his study, and made his way through galleries and up 2 flights of stairs to the door of the Duke of Reichstadt's apartments. At the sight of his sovereign, Foresti proposed to announce him to his pupil. "Do nothing of the kind," said the Emperor. "Where is he?" "In his bedroom, sire." "I'll go there." As he was on the point of entering the room, the Emperor came to a halt. The boy, already as tall as a man of medium height, was walking up and down the room. The door stood ajar, and his grandfather could see him. The Duke, who was wearing a dark tailcoat, walked with his head down and his hands behind his back, with a shambling step. Sometimes he stopped for a moment, with one foot forward, then he went on with his walk. Little by little, the Emperor fell back from the door. He felt as though a ghost had risen on the threshold and thrust him back without even touching him. That figure, that gait, a shiver ran down the Emperor's back. "He walks just like his father," he muttered. "Yes, he walks just like Napoleon." Chapter 41. First Promotion. It was in the course of the winter of 1826 that the Duke of Reichstadt experienced the first attacks of an illness which was soon to become worse. He had grown 3 inches during the past year, and his puberty tired him. Dr. Gless, his usual medical attendant, ordered him to rest and subjected him to strict treatment. The prince was a difficult patient. De Tristan had to write to Marie-Louise to invoke her maternal authority. In the month of February 1827, after seeming to recover, the Duke fell ill again. He coughed and had rather a high temperature. Meanwhile, Gaulis had died. His successor, Dr. Studenheim, prescribed powders and poultices, and prohibited dancing and physical exercise. In the spring, the prince was able to resume his usual occupations. He went for a walk in the Prater every day. He attended reviews with his grandfather. In the evenings, he went to the Burgtheater, or spent his time with Sophie or the Empress Caroline Augusta, who interested herself in him, lent him books, and treated him as a young man. But in the course of the summer, at Baden, he had a relapse. He fainted at the imperial table, and had to be taken back to Schönbrunn, where he spent several days in bed. He was pale and thin, and his voice became hoarse. His arms and legs, attached respectively to a narrow chest and a small pelvis, looked too big for his body. Having little appetite, he did not eat much. If he was not watched, he behaved imprudently. Stadenheim diagnosed him as having a tendency to scrofula and a predisposition to phthisis of the windpipe. He prescribed cold baths and a substantial diet, and forbade horse riding, swimming, and walking in the rain or chilly weather. This queer treatment yielded rather good results. In the month of November 1827, de Tristan was able to report an improvement in the Duke's health to Marie Louise, who had pleaded intestinal troubles as an excuse for not coming to Vienna that year. Nevertheless, despite all the precautions with which he was surrounded, during the winter the Duke contracted bronchitis. He was kept in his room, and stuffed with medicine. It did not occur to anybody that in Parma he would find a climate more suited to his weak chest. He did not recover till the spring. As the days got warmer, he picked up strength, and his enterprising spirit came back to him. He wanted to take up military service at once, but Count de Tristan was afraid that the fatigue of army life might be disastrous to the boy, who was very pale, very thin, and at the age of 17 already measured over 6 feet. But the Duke was insistent, so on June 30th, 1828, his tutor drew up a lengthy report to the Emperor, in which he set forth his fears, and asked the Emperor to postpone the emancipation of his pupil. It would be a great mistake, he wrote, to let the prince go out into the world and expose himself to extreme fatigue before his strength is ready to stand it. The Emperor agreed that de Tristan was right, and the Duke, despite his entreaties, had to bow to his grandfather's will. Happily his mother arrived just at the right time to take his mind off his troubles. He went to meet her at Melk, and accompanied her from there to Schönbrunn. There, on August 17th, he experienced one of the greatest joys of his life. Before dinner, the Emperor had a long conversation with Marie Louise. During dinner, the young man was surprised to find that the whole company was looking at him. The persistent smiles ended by embarrassing him. The company included Count de Tristan and General Neperg, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 2. After dinner, the Emperor assembled his own party, as usual. Then, just as everybody else was withdrawing, he summoned his grandson. "You've wanted something for a very long time, haven't you, Franz?" he asked. "Aye, sire," stammered the prince, with a blush. "Yes. 2 years ago, your mother asked me to give you a lieutenant's commission. I refused. Her Tristan told me that your work did not deserve such a favor." The emperor paused for a moment to give more weight to his words. "But this year your tutors are satisfied with you, so to show you how pleased I am, I appoint you captain in my light infantry regiment." If he had received his baptism of fire from a score of batteries of guns, the new officer could not have been more upset. His throat felt tight, he was weak at the knees, and he scarcely knew what he was doing. He found himself receiving the congratulations of the whole imperial family. In a daze, he was passed on from one to another. Kisses and embraces served as his baptism of fire instead of cannonballs and bullets. Once he was alone, he jumped for joy. His first concern was to write to Captain Foresti. "My very dear comrade, I hasten to tell you about the happiest event in my life, which, to be brief, is as unexpected as it is delightful. An event which paves the way for many things. An event which has suddenly made me the happiest of men." His pen danced across the paper. Captain. At the age of 17 he was a captain, just like Foresti, who was 52. Before long he would be a general. Already he felt upon his brow the burning breath of fame. Chapter 42. The Death of Napoleon. In Parma, Marie-Louise was living through some of the most harrowing hours of her life. During the past few months she had watched her dear Napoleon, whom she had secretly married after Napoleon's death, wasting away from day to day. On the return to Parma in the month of October 1828, he fell ill on the way and had to be carried in a litter. He got thin, his cheeks fell in, and he became a mere shadow of himself. Heart attacks, which prostrated him, succeeded one another at closer and closer intervals. Blistering, bloodletting, even extract of soot taken in large doses brought him no more than passing relief. Marie-Louise was overwhelmed. "I feel that I too am dying with him little by little," she wrote to her father. At the beginning of January 1829, Napoleon seemed better, but at the end of the month he suddenly grew worse. His attacks of suffocation were renewed, and fever wasted him away. He died on February 22nd. For all his fortune, he left a few louis in a drawer and a cardboard box full of orders and decorations. Marie-Louise's despair was pitiable. She had lost, in her own words, the best of husbands, the most faithful of friends, and all her earthly happiness. She commanded an elaborate funeral for her best beloved, and ordered a Carrara marble monument to him. But the emperor put a brake on too dramatic a display of her despair, and refused her permission to wear mourning for her husband. She had to bow to her father's will, for she depended only on him to look after her two children by Napoleon. She never stopped lamenting him, and remained doleful and inconsolable everywhere she went. When she talked about Napoleon, her eyes filled with tears, and she was always talking about him. She put away from her everything that did not remind her of her beloved. She had forgotten all about Paris, and preserved no memory of her life in France. She could not even remember the ladies who had been attached to her service, and if their names were mentioned, she had to ask what they looked like and how they talked. A month and a half after Neperg's death, she gave audience to a Frenchman, Baron de Vitrolles. Speaking to him about her years in Paris, she said to him, "Alas, until now I was very happy here. My earlier life seemed only a bad dream." Finally, in the month of August, she tore herself away from her palace, where her grief preyed upon her, and went to Geneva to take the waters at Aix. Not for a moment did she think of going to Vienna to see her son. She knew that in him she would find a judge ready to pronounce severe sentence upon her. As a mother she feared to blush under her son's eyes. It was the Emperor Francis who had undertaken the thankless task of telling the Duke of Reichstadt that his mother had married again. He did so at the beginning of March 1829, as tactfully as possible. He told the prince that his mother's second marriage had taken place in September 1821, and that 2 children had been born of her union with Neperg. Stricken by the shock, the prince sagged in his seat, just as badly wounded man doubles himself up. He went white and clenched his teeth. But he said nothing. He asked no questions about the children's age. His silence struck the emperor and Tristan as most alarming. But once he was alone, he gave free vent to his feelings. Astonishment, indignation, and shame shared his heart. He felt that the most sacred, the purest thing he had in him, his memory of his father, had been soiled forever. Was it possible? Could his mother, Marie-Louise, Empress of the French, have so completely forgotten Napoleon? Had she really dared to replace him with a minor general, a courtier, a mere major domo of a duchy? What a denial of his memory! He wished he could have in his heart only affection and indulgence for his mother, but he could find there nothing but pity and contempt. The discovery hurt him, so he experienced real relief when he learned that Marie-Louise had given up her intention to visit Vienna that year. Henceforth he felt the phantom of Neperg must always rise between his mother and himself. It turned him more definitely towards the outlaw who had been sacrificed to the hatred of Europe. Little by little, his eyes became opened. He discovered the traps which had held his soul prisoner ever since he was a child. He realized that a conspiracy had been hatched by 100 unseen accomplices to poison his mind. Now the network of deceit gave way link by link. The darkness in which he had struggled became less dense. In the depths of it flickered a light towards which all the strength of his being impelled him. Was it not Napoleon's star which, after all these years of eclipse, had reappeared to guide the steps of his son? The course of events was soon to chase away the last shadows and hasten his steps toward the light. At the beginning of 1829, a young French poet, Barthélemy, arrived in Vienna with the intention of presenting to the Duke of Reichstadt a copy of a poem entitled Napoleon in Egypt, which he had written in collaboration with Miri. Barthélemy was received by de Tristan. The Duke's tutor represented to the poet that the policy of France and Austria alike was opposed to a foreigner, and above all a Frenchman, being introduced to the prince. Barthélemy was astonished that the prince should be surrounded by such precautions. He remarked somewhat rudely, "Then it would appear, Monsieur le Comte, that Napoleon's son is far from being so free as we in France imagine." De Tristan shook his tired head. He replied quietly, "The prisoner is not a prisoner, but he is in a very peculiar position." Barthélemy was persistent. He made all efforts in all directions, but he failed to obtain the audience he desired. He had to content himself with going to the Hoftheater one evening and getting a distant glimpse of the Duke of Reichstadt, whose pale face stood out against the dark background of his box. On his return to Paris, still full of resentment and haunted by the memory of what he had seen in the Hoftheater, Barthélemy wrote and published a long poem entitled The Son of the Man. In it he painted a picture of the prince in the blackest light. He represented him as undermined by some strange suspicious disease, and already in the shadow of death. After covertly accusing Austria of slowly poisoning Napoleon's son, he went on to adjure the prince to pull himself together, maintain his father's tradition, and take refuge in France, which was ready to welcome him. The stir which this poem caused in Paris was equalled only by the indignation which it aroused in Vienna. The King of France thought fit to arrest its author. Barthélemy was put on trial, and on June 29, 1829, sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment. His trial made the echoes ring. It was attended by Victor Hugo and General Gourgaud. His incriminating poem acted like a very dry faggot flung on a smoldering fire. All at once, the flame of Bonapartism sprang up again, and spread crackling until it licked the feet of the throne on which Charles X wriggled very ill at ease. Barthélemy's poem came to the knowledge of the Duke of Reichstadt. His tutors thought him so far prejudiced against France that it would do him no harm to read it. They were wrong. To be sure, Barthélemy had painted a far from flattering portrait of the Duke. Moreover, the author's attack on the court of Vienna shocked the Duke in his feeling of affection for his grandfather, but several passages in it awakened mysterious echoes in him and thrilled him to the soul. Grandson of Caesar, emperor's son, heir of the earth, born king of Rome, today you are but the son of the man, yet for that name obscure, what king's son would not change his heritage? Are you content to bear a name that's worth a crown, without a thought to win it for yourself? With his head in his hands, the Duke meditated for a long time. So they thought about him in France, on the other side of the Rhine. He was not merely the Duke of Reichstadt. this semi-bastard whose birth was kept hidden as though it were a disgrace. In the eyes of a whole nation, he was the King of Rome, Napoleon's son. Millions of men put their faith, their hopes in him. He did not yet know how he could escape from his prison and answer the summons of these men of his own blood, but he felt sure that he would find a way some day. Then would strike the great hour, when before all the world, fate would bring him and his legend face to face. He must make himself ready. The example of his father would serve as his guide. Napoleon had been a great general. He would try to follow in his footsteps. He exerted himself to do so, with such poor means as he had at his disposal. At the end of June 1829, he finally obtained permission to take part in the regimental drill of the battalion of grenadiers, commanded by Prince Gustavus Wasa. 3 or 4 days a week, he got up at 4 o'clock in the morning. An hour later, he arrived at Mar, where the battalion was quartered. Sitting squarely on his horse, in his tight-fitting uniform of captain in the light infantry, the prince drilled his men, issuing his orders in a firm voice. Sightseers gathered all around the parade ground to watch him handling his detachment quickly and decisively. Sometimes cheers greeted Bonaparte's son. To the sound of trumpets, amid the clash of arms and the tramp of marching feet, the eaglet tried his unfledged wings.